Hey guys, tonight we step into a house no one visits, where the curtains stay drawn and the boots by the door aren't from church, they're from the scaffold. You were born into a shadow. You didn't choose it, but you wear it now, like a second skin. A child not cursed by a god, but by a profession. The kind of job that outlives its workers and swallows their children. Before we dive into tonight's odd little adventure, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if this kind of weird storytelling truly speaks to you, and drop a comment to let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always a quiet joy imagining someone in Europe, the Americas, Asia, Africa, or wherever else, listening in from their own cozy corner of the world. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're born into what some would call a decent family, which means no gold buttons, but also no missing meals, just enough to be invisible. Your mother does the mothering. Your father does something. You don't know. He's rarely home. Still, you make it to your first birthday, a feat more impressive than anyone claps for. Roughly 4 out of 10 infants around you don't. They vanish before learning to walk, but you live, you cry, you grow teeth, and you keep breathing. No one throws a party, of course, but your mother exhales like she's been holding it since you were born. And that, right there, is your first clue. This life comes with tension in its bones. You don't know it yet, but survival in your family isn't just chance. It's necessary, because dying young would have been too merciful. By age 3, things start to feel not right. No children visit, no guests. The neighbours are polite, but never kind. You draw in the dirt alone. You're told never to wander. There are wolves. They say, stray ones, big ones. They like the taste of children. You don't question it. Not really. But one day, your mother takes you to the market, and the wolves show up anyway. Not in fur, but in faces. People stare. People whisper. Some flinch. You're 3. You assume you've spilled something or cried too loud. Then someone hisses it under their breath. Executioner's brat. You don't understand the words. Not exactly. But your mother does. She grabs your wrist so tight it burns, and you both disappear into alley smoke. You ask that night. She doesn't answer, but you wait up, for your father, and when he returns, boots muddy, cloak too theatrical for someone so tired, you finally hear the truth. Your father isn't a butcher, not the kind who slices pigs. He's the kind who wears black and steps onto platforms when the crowd has gathered. The kind they call when someone must die. But no one wants the blood on their hands. And now you know why you live in shadow, and why the wolves outside were never really wolves. After that day at the market, the silence in your house starts to hum. You notice the way your mother avoids windows, the way your father, when he's home, always sits with his back to the wall. No visitors, no letters, just the sound of boiling cabbage and a chair that creaks at the same time every evening. You keep asking questions. They keep pretending you're too young for answers, but the world already gave you one. A cruel, hissing word. Executioner's brat. It sticks to your skin like ash. You don't know what it means yet, but you know it makes people flinch. You try to see yourself in the cracked mirror near the door. Are you different? Do you look dangerous? Your mother says no, but she doesn't meet your eyes when she says it. Then you notice something else. Other children cross the street when they see you. Some throw rocks. One spits. So you stop going out. Inside, your world is small. 3 rooms, 1 bed, a shelf of tools that aren't toys. You learn to be quiet, to vanish. You hear whispers through the walls at night, words like curse and bad blood. They're not talking about the plague. They're talking about you. One evening, your father comes home earlier than usual. He's not drunk, not tired. He sits beside you, quiet. And then he tells you what you already sensed. This isn't a job. It's who we are, and no one else will ever let you be anything else. You want to scream. You want to shout that you'll run away, join the Navy, become a cook or a monk or anything that doesn't end with someone else's breath going still. But your father has seen that look before. He tells you his dream. He once wanted to be a knight. He learned swordplay not to kill criminals but to ride with honor. Then his father died, and the blade came for him. It always does, he says. The only choice is how steady your hand will be when it does. That night, you don't sleep. You just stare at the ceiling, wide-eyed, as though it might tell you how to escape a destiny carved in bone. You don't dream of swords anymore, only of the crowd, their eyes, their judgment, and the feeling that no matter where you walk, you'll always be walking to the scaffold. Your childhood ends, not with a birthday, but with a sentence you didn't speak and a name you didn't choose. You're 5 the first time you hear your father laugh. It startles you, not because of the sound, but because of how strange it feels in this house. Laughter doesn't belong here, not under this roof. He's laughing at a letter, one he doesn't read aloud, one he burns right after. When he notices you watching, the smile dies faster than the flame. You'll understand someday, he says, and that phrase becomes the wallpaper of your life. You'll understand someday. It's the lullaby of reluctant legacies. You try, of course. You watch him more. How he oils his boots. How he counts coins twice. How he sharpens his tools with more tenderness than he gives your mother. You ask once if he loves her. He says nothing. Some jobs don't leave room for softness. This is one of them. By age 6, you know what each tool is for, not because someone taught you, but because they sit in plain sight, like utensils in a kitchen no one wants to eat in. There's the sword, not elegant, not knightly, just heavy, functional. There's the rope, coiled like a question no one wants answered, and the small things, pliers, wedges, hooks. Their names are less important than their uses. Your father doesn't speak of those. Instead, he starts bringing you with him, not to executions, not yet, but to the edge of them. You wait outside the courtyard, where the air smells like burnt meat and old sweat. People pass you, faces flushed from shouting, eyes glazed from watching a man die. No one looks at you. They just know what you are, what you're becoming. And then one day, you ask your father, "What if I don't want this?" He doesn't yell, he doesn't hit, he just sighs, a sound deeper than any anger, and tells you the story. How his own father tried to become a blacksmith, moved towns, changed names, hid the truth. But the past has a way of catching up. It showed up in whispers, in missed payments, in customers who stopped coming once they found out. People don't want justice, your father says. They want someone else to hold the sword so they can look away. That night, your mother doesn't join for dinner. Your father eats in silence, staring at nothing. You stare at your plate as if it might teach you how to vanish. You dream of escape, running away to sea, hiding in a monastery. You imagine being anything else, a candle maker, a bookbinder, even a rat catcher. You dream until the dreams get too vivid, until even they start to feel like traps. At 8, you try not to flinch anymore. At 9, you stop asking questions. You begin to understand the rituals of this house, how the door gets bolted 3 times, how visitors leave things at the step but never knock, how your father keeps a book with only dates and names, no faces, no ages, just the condemned and the day they fell. One day, while he's away, you open it. Your own last name appears in every entry, over and over, across decades. That's when you realize your name is not yours. It's a uniform. It wraps around your future like a noose. At 10, your father gives you your first real task, cleaning the tools. You hold the sword with both hands. It feels heavier than your whole body. You drop it once. He doesn't get mad. He just says, if it drops again, it might not be your foot that gets cut. You nod. You clean. You scrub for hours. And when you're done, he takes a coin from his pocket and places it on the table. 1 coin per week, he says. Fair wage. You don't want it, but you take it, because refusing would mean something you're not ready to admit. You're already part of this. Later that week, you buy your first loaf of bread with that coin, and you hate how warm it tastes, because now even hunger knows you're one of them. At 11, your father takes you to the far edge of the execution square, not to watch, not yet, but to hear. You sit behind a wooden screen while the crowd gathers. The air thickens with anticipation, like before a storm. And then, the sound, a cheer, followed by silence, then the heavy thud of justice. You don't cry. You just sit there, fingers curled so tight they leave marks on your palms. Afterward, your father tells you, that man stole 3 loaves of bread. He was hungry, but hungry men aren't harmless. You don't sleep that night. because you're still full of bread, and now it feels stolen. 12 approaches like a sentence. You know what comes next, not because someone tells you, but because there are no more lies left. No more bedtime stories, there's no more distractions. Your birthday arrives with no cake, no candles, just a new knife, small, sharp, with your initials carved into the hilt. Your father hands it to you without a word. You nod, without blinking, because this isn't a gift, it's a contract, and whether you sign it in ink or blood, it binds just the same. 12. You are 12, and your job, officially, begins. No, not killing. That comes later. For now, your task is cleaning, every day, at dawn. You walk to the scaffold with your father. The air smells like dew and old iron. Your boots crunch on gravel that remembers screams, and waiting for you is the aftermath of justice, the stains, the splinters, the smell that never quite fades. Your tools? A bucket, a rag, and a bottle of something that burns your hands but doesn't cleanse your conscience. Your father shows you how to scrub blood from wood, how to check for cracks in the platform, how to burn the ropes after a hanging unless they're still strong enough to be reused. Yes, reused. You ask why. He says, rope's expensive, then adds, besides, it already knows the job. You try not to gag. At first, you pretend it's red wine, spilled stew, anything but what it is. But the smell is always honest. You don't get to pretend long. Some days, you find teeth. Once, a finger. You ask your father what to do with it. He shrugs. Bury it, or feed it to the pigs. You bury it, but not deep. Not because you're lazy, but because you hope someone finds it. You hope it unsettles them. You want the city to feel the weight you're learning to carry, because that's the part no one sees. After the cheering, the crowd goes home, but you stay, you sweep, you gather limbs like kindling, and in that quiet, between the end of a life and the return of the market stalls, you realize something. Death isn't loud. It's residue. You begin to categorize stains like languages. Dark red means a slow bleed. Bright red means arterial. Brown means it's been there too long. You know where each man died based on how the floorboards groan. You know where the sun hits hardest and where flies gather first. Your education is not written in books. It's absorbed through skin, through routine, through repetition. At night, you scrub your hands until they're raw. They never quite smell right again, like rust and regret. Your mother starts keeping distance. She smiles less, touches you less. Like the blood on your hands might leap to hers. You don't blame her. You wouldn't touch you either. One morning your father oversleeps when you go ahead, alone, and you find it. Not a body, not blood, but a name, scratched into the wood. A message, left behind by the last man executed. I forgive you. You stare at it for a long time. The letters are shaky, some are smudged, but it's there. Clear, final. You scrub it off anyway, because you're not allowed to keep anything here, not even mercy. Your first winter as a cleaner is the worst. Blood freezes, splinters turn to knives, and your hands, your poor hands, crack open just from being alive. You wrap them in cloth, but your father says, can't clean with gloves, so you bleed while cleaning blood, and somewhere in that, a line blurs. By the end of the season, you can't remember which wounds are yours and which were left behind. Then, spring comes. With it, the crowds return, the noise, the jeering, another man, another name, another stain. You don't cry anymore. Not because you're stronger, but because crying would mean acknowledging it still hurts, and you can't afford that. One morning, while sweeping under the scaffold, you find a ring, gold, engraved, probably slipped from a dead man's finger. You pocket it. That night, you sleep with it under your pillow, not out of greed, but because it proves something. These were people. They had hands, rings, stories, and yet, here they are, reduced to a smear you're paid to wipe away. Your father sees the ring the next day. He doesn't scold you. He just nods. They don't need it anymore, he says. Neither do you, really, but you keep it anyway. Not as treasure, but as a receipt. You're 12. You haven't killed anyone yet. But death already lives in your muscles. And by now, you understand. You don't need to swing the blade to be part of the execution. Sometimes, it's the one who cleans the blood who carries it the longest. It starts like any other morning. But this one has a different smell. Not blood, not wood smoke. Something sharper, metallic, like fear, freshly drawn. Your father tells you today is important. He doesn't say why, but he doesn't bring the bucket. Instead, he brings you. You follow him down streets that somehow feel narrower, shadows stretch longer. People glance, then look away. When you reach the square, it's already full. Hundreds of bodies packed like livestock. No music, no shouting, just breath and expectation. Your father places a hand on your shoulder. Watch. You don't understand. You think he means watch the crowd, but he turns you toward the scaffold. A man is already there, kneeling, weeping. His hands are tied. His legs shake like he's already halfway dead. The priest murmurs something and a child in the crowd screams. The man on the scaffold hears it. His head jerks. His own child. You look into his eyes, and for the first time, you realize they always look at someone. They don't look at the sky. They don't close their eyes. They look for something human right before they lose everything. The rope goes around his neck. The crowd shifts. Breath holds. You don't want to be here. You want to run, to turn away, to scream that this isn't your life. But your father's hand is heavy, not holding you in place, reminding you that you're already there. Then the floor drops. The rope tightens. His body jerks. His child shrieks, and something inside you splits. It's not the horror, it's the sound. Not the drop, not the snap, but the silence after. You expect relief or disgust. Instead, you feel nothing. And that scares you more than the rest. When it's over, your father doesn't speak. He just starts walking. You follow, legs weak, mouth dry. Back at home, you sit at the table. Your mother serves stew, but you don't taste it. Your hands shake. Your ears ring. Your chest feels too small. Later that night, you vomit in the alley. No one comes to check. You wash your face in a bucket. The water turns pink. You wonder whose blood that is. Sleep doesn't come, but images do. The eyes, the scream, the moment before the rope. It replays, over and over, not as nightmare, as memory. In the morning, you find a piece of the rope, left behind, missed by accident or fate. You pick it up. It's rough. Still warm with meaning, you keep it, hide it under your mattress, like a relic or a warning. For weeks, you don't speak much, not because you're traumatized, but because words feel dishonest now. You know something others don't, something no one talks about, that justice isn't clean, it's not noble, it's a man choking while his child watches. You begin to understand your father better, why he doesn't laugh, why he sharpens his blades without blinking, why his back is always turned to the door. He's not heartless, he's haunted, and one day, so will you be. You're not sure when the fear turns into understanding, but it does. Maybe it's the second execution, or the third. You're not on the scaffold, but you're close enough to smell it, close enough to hear the wood creak, and every time, it hurts less. Not because you're cruel, because your mind builds walls to protect you, and behind those walls, something grows, not evil, not joy, just endurance. At 14, you no longer gag at blood. You no longer flinch at the sound of bone snapping. You don't cry when someone begs for mercy. Not because you think they deserve it, but because you know it won't change anything. You start scrubbing before the crowd even leaves. You no longer wait for silence. You work inside it. That year, you stop dreaming of escape. You stop dreaming altogether. Because now you understand what your father meant. This isn't a job, it's a sentence. And you've already begun serving it. 14. The year your training truly begins. Not cleaning, not watching, not running ropes or sharpening blades. No. This is the year you open the body. Your father says it one evening, over bread that tastes like dust. Tomorrow, you meet your first teacher. You expect a man, maybe a monk with scrolls. What you get is a corpse, a nameless man, dead not by your hand, but not by peace either. He lies on the table, arms splayed like a broken marionette, face covered with a cloth. The smell hits first. It coats the inside of your mouth, turns your stomach into a drum. You want to leave. You don't. Your father pulls the cloth away. The man's eyes are still open. "You'll want to start here," he says, tapping the chest. Then, with a blade thinner than a whisper, he makes the first cut. You gag. You look away. Your father doesn't stop. "Look, or leave," he says. You look. The skin peels back like parchment. The fat gleams. The muscles twitch, maybe from memory. He narrates like a scholar, points to organs, names them like children: liver, lung, spleen, kidney. He touches each with care like they might answer him. Then he hands you the knife. It's smaller than the one you clean with, but heavier. Your hands tremble. You press in. The skin gives. The blood is slow, thick, sticky. You want to scream, but you don't, because you realize something. This man is no longer a man. He's a map, and you're learning to read. Your father shows you the arteries, the bones, the hidden traps, where to cut clean, where to cut deep, where to never cut, unless you want the body to spill like a story without a plot. You learn fast, not because you're gifted, because every mistake earns you a bruise. That vein? Yes. You nicked it. That's 5 lashes. The lashes don't scare you, the failure does, because this isn't about anatomy. It's about control. Executioners don't just kill, they choose. How? How long? How clean? How terrifying? And to choose, you must understand. Your days become filled with flesh, not living, not breathing. Just practice. You stop reacting to the smell. Your hands grow steadier. You develop a habit of humming while you cut, not out of joy, but to keep time. Your mother avoids the basement now. Even the rats keep away. One day, you ask your father why this matters. Why not just swing a sword and be done with it? He looks at you like you asked why the sun rises. Because pain has a language, and we're the translators. You're not sure if he believes that, but the next day, he proves it. He brings in a living man, bound, bleeding. Confess to nothing, your father says. Let's help him remember. What follows is not a lesson, it's a performance. Your father moves with precision, removes a fingernail, waits, asks, nothing. A tooth, waits, asks, still nothing. A second tooth, then 3 words. I took it. Your father smiles, not with joy, with completion, like a craftsman admiring a table. You want to vomit. Instead, you take notes, because whether you like it or not, this is your inheritance. You learn that pulling teeth with bare hands is sloppy. Use pliers, use wedges. Always angle the wrist to avoid jaw fractures unless you want one. You learn how to keep a man conscious during a beating, how to stop a wound just before death, how to make pain feel like truth. You're disgusted, then you're detached, then you're good at it. Your father notices. He nods once, silent approval. At night, you clean the table, burn the rags, you stare at your hands, waiting for them to shake. They don't. That's the most terrifying part. One evening, you stay late after a session. You examine the last body alone. You whisper, I'm sorry, just to see if it helps. It doesn't, but you keep doing it, because someone should. By the end of the year, you've opened 12 bodies, watched 8 confessions, broken 3 fingers by accident and reset them like twigs. You're no longer a boy. You're a blade without a handle, and every time you close your eyes, you see the inside of someone else. And it's starting to feel familiar. There's a moment in your training when the cutting stops being about discovery. It becomes communication. You're 15 now. The knife is no longer foreign in your hand. It rests there like it belongs, like it knows you. Your father no longer needs to watch. You know the rules, the steps, the tempo. It's no longer, how do I open the body? Now it's, how long can I keep it open? And speaking. Because that's the lesson this year. Pain is a language, and you are fluent. Your teacher isn't a book. It's a man strapped to a bench, eyes wide, truth buried in his ribs. You don't hate him. You don't know him. And that, somehow makes it easier. Your father calls it extraction, but let's be honest, this is theatre. The goal isn't just confession, it's confession with flair. He teaches you rhythm, 3 seconds between strikes, too fast, and the body shuts down, too slow, and the mind recovers. You learn where to place the cut, where pain blooms loudest, behind the knees, beneath the fingernails, along the rib line. No blood, if possible. Blood distracts. What you want is sound. And oh, the sounds you get, high-pitched, gurgled, barked, begging in a dozen dialects. You don't need a translator. Pain is universal. The first time someone says please to you, really says it, like a prayer, you freeze. Not from guilt, from awe, because it's the first time someone saw you not as a boy, not as a son, but as a god of their tiny, collapsing world. It is intoxicating and terrifying. Your father watches your face during each session. He's not looking for mistakes. He's looking for mercy. If he sees it, he'll beat it out of you. Mercy is for men with choices, he says. You have none. You don't argue anymore. You just nod. At night, you stop dreaming of the people you hurt. You start dreaming as them. You wake up gagged, strapped, screaming, but the sound never leaves your throat. You whisper your own name sometimes just to remember it. It sounds like someone else's. Your tools become an extension of you. Pliers, wedges, twine, heated spoons. You keep them clean, not out of respect for precision, because one slip, one uncontrolled tear, and the body might never speak again. That would be failure, and you hate failure more than you hate pain. Your father once tortured a man for 11 hours. He told you the story while slicing bread. He never broke, he said, but I did. You didn't understand it then. You do now, because there comes a point where it's not about them confessing. It's about you continuing, because stopping means admitting you could have stopped earlier, and the moment you ask, was it worth it, is the moment your hands begin to shake. You can't afford that. So you bury the question under layers of ritual. You heat the irons, you unroll the cloth, you light the lantern just so, you breathe in, 3 counts, out, 2. You speak calmly to your subject, never shout. Shouting is desperation. You are not desperate. You are professional. And when the scream comes, because it always comes, you don't flinch. You mark the time. You write down the word. Your records are meticulous. Your father says you're the best apprentice he's ever had. You say nothing, because praise feels like a bruise. One evening, you finish early. Your subject confessed in 10 minutes. You barely had to touch him. You feel disappointed, and that shame burns worse than anything you've inflicted. You walk home slowly that night. Street lamps flicker. The air feels too quiet. You pass a couple kissing behind a shop. They pull away when they see you, not because they know who you are, because they feel it. Like dogs sense earthquakes. You wonder if there's something in your gait, your eyes, your shadow. You wonder if you still pass for human. Back home, your mother won't meet your gaze. She offers soup. You decline. You sit in the dark, staring at your own hands. They're steady, efficient, clean, too clean. You wonder if scrubbing harder would make them yours again. But the truth settles like dust. They've never been yours. Not since the day you learned how to hurt someone without hating them. And worse, how to stop hating yourself for it. That's when you know you're not becoming your father. You've already arrived. You thought the knife was the final test, that once your hands stopped trembling, you were ready. But your father shakes his head. You can't just be sharp, you have to be correct. And so begins the most brutal chapter of all, paperwork. You're 16 now, and every evening is a lesson in the slow bleed of ink. Scrolls, codes, decrees, some written in a language even your father stumbles through. He unrolls one with a sigh. This, he says, is how you kill legally. You thought law was for scholars, for judges in powdered wigs. Turns out, it's also for butchers in cloaks. Each execution must follow form, correct charges, proper witnesses, final blessings. If you misquote a statute, no matter how guilty the man, you're the one in trouble. You want to protest. You want to scream, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a blade, but you don't, because now you know better. Justice doesn't live in truth. It lives in footnotes. Your days are split now. Mornings with corpses, nights with clauses. You learn to read quickly, memorize faster. Your father quizzes you during supper. What statute governs treason? Section 19, paragraph 3. And punishment? Quartered. Unless of noble blood, then beheading. He nods, chews, swallows. You take a bite of bread that tastes like parchment. At first, you think this is boring. Then you realize it's terrifying, because in these scrolls lie the difference between sanctioned murder and criminal execution. One wrong phrase, and the priest won't show up. One missing seal, and the city washes its hands of you. Your father shows you an old letter. A colleague, once an executioner, now rotting in prison. Be sharp with your sword, the letter says. Be sharper with your Latin. You don't sleep that night. You start copying scrolls by candlelight. Not because you must, but because fear makes a good tutor. You memorize the different terms for guilt. You learn how long a prisoner must fast before confession. You learn the legal length of a hanging rope based on body weight. No one ever told you justice was math. And yet, here you are, calculating how far a man must fall before his neck breaks, but not too quickly. Somewhere in the margins, you feel your humanity cracking. You find a list once, your father's handwriting, not names, not methods, just 1. Crime. 2. Law cited. 3. Date. 4. Outcome. 5. Number of strokes. 5 columns. Years of death compressed into rows. You stare at the list for hours. It doesn't bleed. It doesn't beg. It just organizes. Your father sees you looking as he sits beside you, says nothing. Then finally, this is the difference between what we do and what mobs do. And he's right. A mob acts on rage. You act on procedure. You become the state's steady hand, not a killer, a clerk of consequence. And still, people hate you. That's the irony. The cleaner your work, the more they whisper, as if precision makes it colder. You learn that not all crimes are equal. Some deaths are required, others are convenient. And when you ask who decides that, your father looks away, so you stop asking. Instead, you perfect the dance. You enter the execution square like a man delivering mail. You say the words just right. You bow to the priest. You nod to the magistrate. You raise your blade, not because you believe, because the scroll said so. You are the footnote made flesh. One day, you meet a man sentenced under an outdated law. You know it. He knows it. The magistrate knows it. But the scroll is signed. Your father says, "Do your job." So you do. But that night, you write his name in your own journal. Not the official list. Yours. A secret page where you keep the ones who shouldn't have died. It starts with 1 entry, then 5, then 10, and still, you do the job. Because even mercy, if unapproved, is illegal. By the end of your training, you can recite most laws in your sleep. You speak them like prayers, except no one is saved. You graduate in silence, no ceremony, just your father, nodding. You're ready. Ready for what? To kill? To document? To live with both? You don't ask. Because now you understand the rule beneath all others. Law isn't about justice. It's about order. And your blade is just another way to keep the line from breaking. You know the date before your father speaks it. It's carved into your spine the way old warriors feel the rain. You've trained, memorized, practiced. But nothing prepares you for the scaffold when it's your name on the list, not the condemns. Your father hands you the black cloak. You hold it like it's alive. It's not for hiding, he says. Everyone already knows who you are. It's for them, he adds, nodding toward the window. Fear wraps easier than skin. You put it on. It itches. Not the fabric, the memory of everyone who wore it before you. Their weight settles on your shoulders with the fabric. You don't eat breakfast. Your stomach is full of something else. Not dread, not excitement, just weight. You walk behind your father through the crowd. They part, but not in respect, in recoil. Children grab their mothers. Merchants mutter. A woman spits at your boots. You step over it. You climb the steps. The scaffold creaks, like it remembers. The magistrate is there. The priest murmurs. Your father stands beside you, but one step behind. You are the sword now. He is the shadow. The condemned man is dragged forward, knees scraped, eyes swollen. He doesn't fight, not anymore. The priest says final rites. The man mutters something, not to you, but to someone you can't see. You raise the blade. It doesn't tremble, but your ribs do. Inside, your body is screaming. Outside, you are stillness in boots. Your father's voice echoes in your skull. Fake it till you make it. You look down, meet the man's eyes. They are already somewhere else. You swing, clean, smooth, fast. The head drops. The crowd gasps. Not because it's gruesome, because it's silent. You step back, wipe the blade, breathe. You did it, and that terrifies you more than if you hadn't. The magistrate nods. The priest refuses to look at you. A child cries. A coin hits the platform. You walk off. Your father doesn't say well done. He says, again, because this is not a milestone, it's a beginning. That night you lie awake. The image won't leave. Not the blood, not the eyes, the quiet, the way the crowd gasped and then moved on, back to bread stalls, back to gossip. You killed a man. They'll forget by lunch. But you won't. Your father gives you your first coin. Executioner's pay, he says. You stare at it. You're paid in silver, but the memory will always cost more. In the morning, your name is added to the official register. No fanfare, just ink. You are now the city's assistant executioner. The blade fits your hand like it grew there. You start to refine your grip, angle, shoulder tension, follow through. You cut better, not faster, cleaner. The crowds notice. They whisper differently now, not disgust. Fear. Your father retires without ceremony, just hands you the register, his signature on the last line, then yours, and now the scaffold is yours, completely. You walk it alone, you clean it alone, you raise the blade without a second voice in your ear, and the thing is, you're good, too good. No botched strokes, no extra blood. Sometimes people don't believe it's over until the head hits the ground. They don't clap, they curse, because you do what they paid to see, too well. You make it real. You walk through the market weeks later. Elizabeth is there. Her father was your fourth. She sees you. You're wearing his coat. She says nothing, just stares. You nod. She turns away. And that's the moment you realize. You will never be forgiven. Not for killing, but for doing it efficiently. That night you sit with the register, trace your name and the margin beside it. You write one word, sharp, not as praise, as a warning, to yourself, because now that the crowd knows your name, so does the guilt. They say you have privileges now, a generous wage, a permanent post, the power to quiet a city square with a glance. You even get a house. Not in the heart of town. No, that would be too confrontational. Your new home is just far enough away that no one has to see you unless they want to. And they don't want to. The landlord hands you the key without touching your hand. Still, it's yours. Stone walls, a roof, privacy. You furnish it with items taken from the dead, a mirror from a thief, a coat from a liar, a silver spoon that once belonged to a noble who died with mud in his mouth. You eat from it anyway. You're allowed to keep what they leave behind. It's written into your contract. The executioner may claim property unspoken for. A polite way of saying, pick the bones clean. At first, it feels like justice, reparations for the disgust they throw at you. But then you catch your reflection in a stolen mirror, wearing a dead man's boots, buttoning a dead man's coat. You don't feel powerful. You feel borrowed. The townspeople whisper louder now. They flinch harder. Some cross themselves when you pass. Not because they fear death, because you make death feel too organized. You're no longer the butcher's boy. You're the blade in the city's hand. And they hate that the blade walks. You walk through the market. A woman drops her basket when she sees you. Apples roll. You kneel to help. She screams. You stand. Leave the apples. Better to be cruel by absence than kind by instinct. That night, you dine alone. The silver spoon feels heavier. You get invited to a wedding once, but only as a necessity. The groom was your subject's cousin. They needed someone to represent closure. You attend in silence. No one speaks to you. The bride won't make eye contact. At the meal, Your chair is last to be served, and yet you eat first, because no one else touches their food until you do. They wait, not out of respect, out of superstition. They believe your presence poisons bread unless appeased. Your father warned you, they will give you gold and call you cursed. He was right. Your wealth grows. You own things, land, furniture, a cloak warmer than any soldier's, but none of it is yours, because every thread, every coin, every candle was earned by taking something from someone who had none left to give. And still they expect you to marry, to be respectable, stable, anchored. You laugh once, bitterly. Who would marry the man who wears dead men's shoes? But you do marry. Not out of love, at first, but out of logic. She is a whore, technically. But you stop using that word the moment she sits across from you and doesn't look away. She knows what people say. People say things about her too. No family, no church, just a sharp tongue and a calm gaze. You like her. She never asks you what you've done. She only asks if you've eaten. You marry in silence. No priest, no blessing. Just her, you, and a ring taken from a man who lied under oath. You wear it anyway. You move her into your house. She redecorates. Removes the coat rack with the noose. Covers the mirror you never liked. One night, you come home to stew on the fire. She sits across from you, takes your hand, doesn't flinch. For a moment, just one, you feel human. It doesn't last, but it visits, and that is enough. You go to work the next morning with a sharper step. The crowd still glares. The priest still spits after the blessing. But now, when you return, someone says, "Welcome home," and it almost makes the screams quieter. Almost. You tell yourself this is balance, that for every head you sever, there is now a warmth waiting in the hearth. But deep down, you know, she doesn't love the blade. She loves the man it hasn't fully destroyed. Not yet. And so, for her sake, you keep a list, not of names, of days without guilt. It's short, but you read it often, because even if the world hates you, she doesn't. Not entirely, and that's the most dangerous privilege of all. They say love softens a man. You wish that were true, because she does love you, in her own silent, symmetrical way. Not with poems, not with praise, but with presence. She stays. That's more than most would do. Your wife doesn't flinch when you return home with blood on your boots. She doesn't ask questions you can't answer. She just nods toward the basin. Leave them outside. The smell stays longer than guilt. You don't know what you expected. Jealousy, fear, maybe even revulsion. But she's past that. She's not shocked. She's aligned. There's a steadiness to her, like a house built on swamp. It shouldn't stand, but somehow does. She knows the names of your tools, keeps a drawer of clean rags. Once, she sharpens your blades when you're too tired to do it yourself. You ask her once why she married you. She shrugs. Everyone else wanted to change me. You never asked me to be good. You nod. It's not romance, it's recognition. The city watches, of course, watches her like they watch you, with suspicion disguised as piety. But she doesn't care. She walks beside you in the market, hand in yours. She picks fruit like it's any other day. And when a baker refuses to serve you, she spits in his flour and smiles. You have never loved anyone more. She never speaks of her past. You never ask. But you piece things together. Scars hidden beneath lace, flinches when windows slam. You know pain when you see it, and she sees it in you, I too. Sometimes you wake at night, breath caught between dream and scream. She places her hand on your chest, not to comfort, but to remind you that you're still here, alive. For now, you begin to live in patterns. Breakfast, silence, chores, execution, supper, silence again. But with her, the silence doesn't ache. It hums. She plants herbs near the window. You bring her bones for broth. It's domesticity built from ash. You talk about building a crib someday. She doesn't laugh. And you think, maybe ghosts can raise the living. The city gossips. Of course. Who could love a butcher? She's cursed herself. But neither of you care. Because for the first time, You are not alone in your exile. You are not a monster in a cave. You are a man in a kitchen, peeling onions while your wife hums an old song no one else remembers. One night, you find her crying. She doesn't speak. You don't ask. You just sit beside her. It's enough. Later, she says, you can be two things at once. You can be the hand of death and still hold a baby without dropping it. You nod. You don't know if that's true, but you want it to be. You begin to dream again, not of blades or crowds, of fields, a home far from the city, children who don't flinch at your touch. And every time she looks at you without fear, you believe, for a moment, that maybe you deserve that dream. Maybe. But dreams, like knives, cut both ways, and you know better than anyone. Nothing sharp stays safe for long. Time doesn't pass in days anymore. It passes in names. Each morning, a scroll. Each scroll, a sentence. Each sentence, a face you'll never forget and a voice you'll never hear again. The city has stopped pretending you're a man. Now you're a function, a black cloak, a signature, a certainty in uncertain times, 1,000 executions. That's what the clerk says, smiling with ink-stained teeth. You've made history. He chuckles. You nod. But in your head, it doesn't feel like history. It feels like accumulation, like dust, like ghosts with name tags. Some you remember by the weight of their body, some by the way they wept, some by the clothes they wore still hanging in your wardrobe, but most blur. Not because you don't care, because you cared for too long and it nearly killed you. So now you catalogue, not by crime, but by how loud the crowd was, by how quiet the condemned became, by how fast you could end it. You're fast now, faster than your father ever was. Your blade doesn't shake, your posture never falters. People say watching you is like watching death pour tea, elegant, precise, terrifying. Children whisper your name in games, priests avoid your eyes. The mayor calls you necessary. You call yourself tired. At night, you sleep beside your wife. Sometimes, other times, you sleep by the fire, fully clothed, waiting for a name to visit. And they do. Faces, 1,000 of them, all asking the same question. Do you remember me? You always do. That's the curse. People think it's the blood, the isolation, the social damnation, but the real curse is memory, because when you remember them, you carry them, and the weight is bone deep. Your wife notices the dark under your eyes. She brews tea, you sip it. You don't talk about the dreams. You talk about the garden. The herbs are doing well. The time survived winter. You wonder if anything truly survives. Your fame spreads beyond the city. Other towns request your services. You ride out, cloak packed, blade wrapped. You do the job, ride home, say nothing. Your daughter asks why you travel. You tell her. To help people. She believes you. That belief cuts deeper than any sword. Sometimes, your son watches you sharpen the blade. He's too young, but you remember being too young, and you know how soon that ends. One day, a man kneels before you and thanks you. Thanks you. For making it quick, he says. For being kind with your hands. You hesitate. Not because you doubt, but because he doesn't. And that faith breaks something. You nod. Raise the blade. End him. Later, you sit in the dark, not weeping, not shaking, just holding the blade like a question. You think about quitting. But who would take your place? Some zealot? Some butcher without rhythm? And would that be kinder? You don't know. All you know is the list grows longer, your name grows colder, and the faces grow louder in your dreams. You begin writing them down, not in the register, in a little leather book hidden beneath a floorboard. You don't list crimes, only things they said. I didn't do it. Tell my wife, make it fast. Thank you. That last one appears too often, and every time it hurts a little more. 1,000 executions. You don't feel accomplished. You feel haunted, and you know, deep down, you're not done yet. There's always another name, always another face, and no matter how good you are, death doesn't give pensions. It just gives you time to remember. You always thought the first thing to go would be your mind. Turns out it's your hands. It starts with small things, a dropped spoon, a missed button. You tell yourself it's nothing, cold weather, bad sleep. But deep down, you know, your grip is changing and not like a door slowly closing, like a hinge starting to crack. You sharpen the blade slower now, more deliberate, less confident. The cloth slips, the oil bottle tips, and for the first time in decades, you cut yourself, not badly. A nick, but it bleeds longer than you expect. Your wife notices the tremble. She says nothing, just brings tea, steady as always. You begin counting your steps, measuring your motions, practicing swings at night when no one is watching. But you're always watching, and the fear grows, not of killing, but of missing. Because in your work, there are no do-overs. One wrong angle, one slow swing, and mercy becomes mutilation. You remember your father's last execution. He trembled, too. The blade struck bone. It took 3 strokes. People screamed. The priest wept. Your father didn't speak for a week. He retired soon after. You didn't understand then. You do now. Your shoulder aches more often. Your breath shortens on the scaffold. Sometimes you see 2 necks instead of 1. Still, you perform, because that's what you do. You raise the blade, you make it clean, you go home. You don't talk about it. But the whispers return. Not about your cruelty, about your age. His hands are slipping, someone mutters in the market. You crush the apple in your hand. Not from strength, from rage. Not at them, at time. Because no one trains you for this part. The part where your body becomes the traitor. Your wife watches you dress for work. She laces your cloak slower now, like stalling time. You could stop, she says gently. You smile. I could, but you don't. Because if not you, then who? Some young fool who thinks this is glory? Who doesn't know how to cut clean? One morning, your son finds you practicing. He watches your hands, then he looks at his own. You both say nothing, but you both know, and that night your dreams change, and no more faces to just echoes, just limbs, just your own voice, whispering names you didn't mean to forget. Your journal grows heavier, not from ink, from guilt. You try herbal tonics, stretching, a salve made by an old midwife with too many rings. Nothing helps. Your wife begins walking with you to the square. She doesn't climb the steps. She just waits nearby, like a candle kept burning for after the storm. You perform 5 executions in a week. The last one, your hand jerks, not visibly, but you feel it. The crowd doesn't notice. The priest does. He lowers his eyes when it's done, not in prayer, in concern. You sit longer that night, by the fire, by the blade, by the fear. You trace the scar on your palm, the one you got at 15. It feels deeper now. You whisper to yourself, not yet, not yet, because you know the time is coming, when the blade will fall crooked, when the name in the scroll will be yours, and there's no clause for that, no statute, no clean way out. You are the hand of justice, but your hands are tired. And in that exhaustion, you feel something worse than pain. Doubt. And once doubt sets in, the next execution becomes the real question. Will it be clean? Will it be enough? Will it be your last? You never meant to teach him. That was the promise. Whispered to yourself in your 20s, shouted inside your skull in your 30s. It ends with me. You sharpen that vow like a blade. But blade's dull, and now your hands tremble, and your son is watching. He's older now. Not a child, not yet a man. Just old enough to see the weight in your shoulders, but not yet old enough to run from it. He asks you one day, quietly, what happens if you miss? You pause. You don't say, the crowd turns. You don't say, the priest refuses to bless. You don't say, the dead man screams. You say, then someone else pays the price. And he understands, because he's always been watching. He knows the rhythm of your footsteps. He knows when a name lingers too long on your tongue. And so, one morning, without fanfare, you place the knife on the table. You don't tell him to pick it up. He does. He holds it wrong. Of course he does. So did you. You correct him. Not with words, with hands. His fingers are cold. Yours shake. It feels like holding your own reflection. Training begins. Not like yours. No bruises. No screaming. You explain softly, deliberately, because if this is the cycle, let it be less cruel this time. You start with the history, not of executions, of your family. He learns the names, the patterns, the reasons that were never really reasons. You take him to the scaffold, empty, this time, just wood and silence. You show him how to stand, where the sun hits the blade, where the crowd looks first. He listens, too well. One day, he asks, "Did you ever dream of doing something else?" You say, "Yes." He asks, "What stopped you?" You say, "Everything." He doesn't ask again. At night, your wife watches you both. She doesn't stop you. She doesn't support you. She just endures it, like the sky endures smoke. One afternoon, your son finds your journal. The one beneath the floorboard, the one with the names that haunt. He reads one entry, then closes it. He doesn't say anything. You don't ask, because now he understands what he's inheriting. Not just the tools, the memories. You train him slower than your father trained you. Not because he's slow, because you're afraid of how quickly he learns. He handles the blade better than you did. His hands don't shake. You want to be proud. You are. And it breaks your heart. He performs mock executions on sandbags. You correct his stance, his swing. He gets it right. Again, and again, and again. You wonder if this is love or betrayal, passing on the same chain with better polish. The first time he watches a real execution, he doesn't flinch. Afterward, he vomits in the alley. You say nothing. You just hand him water. He nods. You realize then, he won't run. He'll stay. And someday, he'll take your place, and he'll teach someone else, and the knife will keep turning. One night, by the fire, he asks, does it ever stop feeling wrong? You look him in the eye, and you lie. You say, eventually. Because some lies are softer than truth. Because mercy isn't always in the swing. Sometimes it's in the silence after, and so you pass him the blade. Not because he asked, because the world will ask him one day, and you'd rather he be ready when it does, even if it means becoming the father you swore you'd never be. He stands where you once stood, back straight, blade steady, cloak too large for his shoulders, but only just. The crowd doesn't gasp, not yet. They're watching, waiting, some with fear, others with hunger. You stand behind him. Not as father, not even as teacher, just as shadow. It's his scaffold now. The condemned is young, barely older than your son. Some part of you winces, another part catalogues the position of the rope. Your son steps forward. He doesn't hesitate, doesn't blink. You see it in his jaw, the tension you taught him. You see it in his wrist, the flick you perfected. You see it in his eyes, the distance you never could shake. The priest mumbles, the crowd shuffles, and then the blade fall, clean, swift, a single breath between life and legend. The crowd exhales, the world moves, but you stay still, because it's done. He's done it, and the silence that follows is different now. It isn't reverent, it's resigned. The boy steps back. He doesn't look at you. He doesn't need to. You walk home side by side. That night, he eats well. He doesn't vomit, doesn't pace, just cleans the blade in silence, and you watch, unsure whether to feel pride or grief. Your wife holds your hand in the dark. You did what you had to, she says. You nod, but deep down, you wonder, did I? The next week, there's another scroll, another name, but they don't call you. They call him, and he goes, without hesitation, without question. And just like that, the weight you carried for so long is lifted, but not gone. It doesn't leave. It just moves. You see it in his posture now, the way he sleeps lighter, the way his journal grows thicker. You find one under his mattress, or it's like yours. But the handwriting is different, sharper, smaller, focused. You read one line. First mercy denied. You close it. Carefully. He's better than you were. Faster, calmer, but not colder, and that's what scares you, because you know what it costs to stay warm in this job. You know how it drains, how it rusts, how it erodes. One morning he asks, when did it start feeling normal? You don't answer, because it never did. But maybe that's the point. Maybe it shouldn't. The city loves him now, or at least fears him efficiently. They say he's your improvement, your legacy perfected. They don't say your name anymore, not unless it's in passing, and that, somehow, hurts more than the rest. But you say nothing. You just watch him from the doorway, polishing the blade, checking the rope, preparing for someone else's final breath. You want to warn him. You want to say, it's not the killing that breaks you, it's the remembering. But he already knows. You see it in the way he watches the crows. You sit at the fire that night, alone, the cloak folded, the register closed, and for the first time in years, you feel something strange. Not peace, not redemption, just stillness, like the world kept spinning, and finally, you got off the wheel. He stands on the scaffold now, but part of you still stands there too, because legacy isn't just what we pass down, it's what we never managed to let go. You wake, not to the roar of crowds, but to birdsong, not to the weight of the cloak, but the warmth of morning light spilling across your blanket. There is no scaffold outside your window, only trees, a garden, a chipped mug waiting to be filled. You're not him. But maybe you carry parts of him, the one who did what needed doing, the one who survived what should have broken him, the one who wondered, quietly, if peace was ever possible after a life of sharp things. And maybe you felt that too. Maybe your blade was different, a duty, a silence, a sacrifice that no one thanked you for. Maybe you've learned to move with care, to love with hesitation, to flinch at your own reflection. But here's the mercy. You are not bound by his ending. You live now. You have choices. Small ones, glorious ones. To say no when your body says rest. To say yes to laughter, even if it trembles at first. To hold your child or your breath with tenderness. You stand at the edge of the past, the blade is behind you, and what lies ahead is softer. A walk, a soup, a sentence you don't have to finish. So, sleep now, not as a man who carried death, but as someone learning to carry life, gently, bravely, knowing that even the hardest hands can still open, and that every new morning is a scaffold you get to step away from, by choice, this time. Cesare Beccaria entered the world not with a cry of rebellion, but with the quiet rustle of silk sheets in a palazzo in Milan. The year was 1738, and the walls of his family's home echoed more with expectations than lullabies. Born into minor nobility, Cesare was handed a life already drafted, comfortable, educated, invisible, the kind of existence that was meant to be lived politely, without disruption, like the ticking of a well-kept clock. But the boy was not born to tick quietly. He watched, even before he spoke, eyes large, always scanning, always measuring. He noticed how servants stiffened when his father entered a room. He saw the way his mother's voice dipped whenever religion was mentioned, not out of reverence, but out of habit, as if certain things were best left unquestioned. By age 7, Cesare had already memorized which corridors of their house echoed secrets and which corners were safe for silence. The comfort around him, the tapestries, the orderly meals, the piano lesson, did not bring ease. They brought pressure, as if the walls themselves whispered, "Be grateful, be obedient, be quiet." It was during a public festival that the first fissure cracked through this serene facade. He was 10. There was laughter in the streets, cheap wine in everyone's cups, and a stage erected in the square for what the crowd called justice. A man, convicted of theft, was to be executed. It was not an uncommon spectacle. Children were brought to watch, as if witnessing death could nourish moral growth. Cesare stood there, shoulder height to the murmuring mass. The executioner raised the blade. A priest muttered a blessing with the indifference of someone reciting a shopping list. The thief wept, not for his soul, but for the daughter he would not see grow up. Then, a flash of steel, a thud, a cheer. Everyone applauded. Cesare did not. He did not cry. He did not run. He simply stood there, blinking at the blood that pooled near the platform like spilled ink from a broken idea. Later that evening, over supper, the family spoke of the festival, the music, the vendors, the crowd. No one mentioned the execution. Not even his father, who had been close enough to smell the copper in the air. That night, Cesare dreamt of the condemned man, but not of his death, of his face, of his trembling hands, of the moment before the blade, when the whole world held its breath. The next morning, Cesare asked a question. Was it right? His tutor looked up from a book. What? To kill him? The room froze like winter had walked in. You are too young to ask that, the tutor replied. There are rules, there is law. Cesare blinked. But is law always right? The tutor closed the book. Thus began the lifelong argument that would shape Cesare Beccaria's soul. An argument not just with kings and judges, but with death itself. In school, he excelled in mathematics. Logic made sense. Equations didn't bleed. But as he grew, so did the ache of contradiction. How could a society so fond of order allow such chaos in its punishments? Why did pain become policy? Why was death called justice? His friends talked of inheritance and diplomacy. Cesare read Montesquieu and Locke in secret, scribbling thoughts in margins like prayers no priest could bless. The child born into comfort had become a young man haunted by clarity. He did not want to be a rebel, but the world would not stop handing him reasons. Every time he walked past the square, he imagined another body, another applause, another silence at dinner. The shadows had raised him well, but now he was beginning to speak. Milan's finest academy did not smell like rebellion. It smelled like ink, candle wax, and the polished wood of desks older than most students' family trees. When Cesare Beccaria first stepped through its iron gates, he was 16, polite, polished, and precisely the kind of boy his tutors hoped would become a magistrate or clergyman, a future paved with Latin phrases and cautious opinions. But Cesare was not cautious. Not really. Not inside. He kept the performance up, of course. That was part of the dance. He bowed when expected, recited Cicero when prompted, and debated legal procedure with the exact amount of passion that wouldn't raise suspicion. But under that powdered surface, something had begun to smoulder. The academy taught him what to think. He wanted to learn how to think. One day, during a rhetoric class, the professor posed a question. What is the purpose of punishment? The usual answers floated up like bubbles in wine. Deterrence, moral correction, divine justice. Cesare said nothing. Later, in his dormitory, he wrote in his notebook, "If punishment teaches nothing but fear, what kind of citizen does it create?" His roommate, a boy named Pietro Verri, peeked over his shoulder and smiled. "You're going to get us both arrested." Cesare smirked. "Not if I speak in metaphors." And so began one of the most quietly dangerous friendships in Enlightenment Italy. Pietro, older and already restless with aristocratic boredom, introduced Cesare to a secret circle of thinkers, poets, and malcontents. They met in candlelit libraries and foggy gardens, reading Voltaire by moonlight, critiquing monarchs over stolen wine. They called themselves Il Café, not because they drank much coffee, but because they were addicted to sharp thought and sleepless conversation. It was in one of these meetings that Cesare heard, for the first time, the phrase that would haunt his future. The law is not always just. He knew this already, of course. He had known it since the square, since the applause, but hearing it aloud, unashamed, unapologetic, felt like inhaling for the first time in years. Still, knowledge is never weightless. With every book he read, the world grew heavier. He learned of children sentenced to death for stealing bread, of tortures disguised as interrogations, of judges who wore mercy like a mask they could remove after hours. He didn't weep, he wrote. His notebooks filled like arteries clogging with outrage. Why do we kill to show that killing is wrong? If the state may torture, what then makes it nobler than a bandit? Each phrase a spark, each question a crack in the marble of inherited obedience. Pietro noticed the change. "You write like someone with a deadline," he said. "I write like someone who's running out of excuses," Cesare replied. One day, during a philosophy lecture, Cesare stood up, not to answer, but to challenge. If laws are made by men, and men are flawed, what sanctity do these laws have? The room went silent. The professor, an old priest with eyebrows like quills, stared at him. "Beccaria," he said slowly, "do not confuse arrogance with enlightenment." Cesare sat down, heart pounding. Later that night, he rewrote the moment in his notebook, not with regret, but with precision. They fear questions more than they fear answers. His father was summoned to the academy shortly after. The elder Beccaria, a man whose voice could polish brass by proximity, was not pleased. "You are not a philosopher," he told Cesare. "You are a Beccaria. You will marry well, serve quietly, and die respected. That is the order." Cesare nodded, but inside, something old and soft had broken. The boy who once whispered questions into the dark had grown teeth. He finished the academy, with honours, of course, because rebellion is quieter when dressed in excellence. But the stage was set. The mind sharpened, the fire stoked. He would not serve quietly, and death, the state's favourite performance, would soon have a new critic. The first draft came quickly, too quickly. Cesare Beccaria sat hunched over a desk in the very family villa, ink bleeding across parchment like a wound that refused to clot. Pietro Verri paced behind him, muttering suggestions, edits, warnings. But Cesare's hand moved faster than caution. They had decided, recklessly, gloriously, to write a treatise, not a critique, not a pamphlet, a manifesto, a blueprint for the reformation of justice itself. Cesare would be its voice. Pietro and his brother Alessandro would be its midwives, its protectors, its publishers. The title, On Crimes and Punishments. It sounded dry, deliberate, harmless. But every sentence Cesare wrote was a blade aimed at the throat of tyranny. He began with a premise so simple, so radical, that it threatened to undo centuries of blood-soaked custom. Laws exist to preserve, not to destroy. From there, the pen turned fire. He wrote that torture was a crime masquerading as process, that executions were not justice but public vengeance, that the punishment should never exceed the necessity to prevent further harm, that certainty of punishment, not severity, was the true deterrent. He dared to say it plainly, the state should not kill in the name of the order. It was heresy, elegant, reasoned heresy, and Cesare knew it. Every sentence felt like dragging truth into daylight, naked and trembling. He feared what might come, but he feared silence more. His health suffered. He stopped sleeping. He forgot to eat. Pietro brought him soup, which grew cold while Cesare debated comma placement. Alessandro begged him to rest. Cesare waved him off. "The longer I wait, the more they die," he whispered. Sometimes, while writing, he heard voices in his head. Not madness, memory. The screams from execution squares, the prayers of condemned men, the silence of crowds trained not to flinch. He transcribed them all, gave them words, gave them dignity. The book was completed in just a few months, a slim volume, barely enough to stop a window from rattling. But inside, it held dynamite. They published it anonymously. When it arrived in bookshops, it did not whisper. It thundered. On Crimes and Punishments spread like rumour on fire, smuggled under cloaks, quoted in salons, debated in royal courts. It reached Paris, London, even St. Petersburg, where Catherine the Great herself read it with interest, and a hint of nervousness. The book didn't just make arguments, it made enemies. Clergy called it blasphemous. Judges called it naive. Politicians called it dangerous. The Inquisition sniffed around like a wolf circling a wounded deer. But the people read it in secret and felt something ancient inside them stir, hope, rage, recognition. And Cesare panicked. The attention, the praise, the threats, they crushed him. He never intended to be a martyr. He wanted change, not celebrity. One night, Pietro found him trying to burn his own manuscript notes in the fireplace. "What are you doing?" Pietro cried. "I was never meant to be their voice," Cesare said, eyes hollow. "I just wanted to think aloud." But it was too late. The world had heard him, and it would not forget, for a brief, impossible moment. Cesare stood at the centre of a storm he had summoned. A quiet man with trembling hands and furious ideas, rewriting the laws of death. He began to receive letters, dozens, then hundreds, pleas from prisoners, questions from reformers, threats from clerics, invitations from monarchs. One letter, unsigned, simply read, "You've given me a reason to live. Thank you." Cesare folded it into his journal. He never told anyone, but he read it every night before bed. That winter, Milan seemed colder than usual. Not from weather, but from tension. Rumours whispered of retribution, that the church would act, that the Habsburg authorities would silence him. Cesare began walking with his head down, his coat collar high. He stopped attending salons. He visited his parents more often. His mother served tea with trembling hands. "Why do they hate you?" she asked one afternoon. "Because I asked them to stop killing," he said. She nodded. "Then write more." Cesare laughed. He hadn't expected that. "I raised a coward," she said, "but God gave me a lion." He never forgot those words. Not when the Vatican summoned him for questioning. Not when his book was placed on the church's index of forbidden books. Not even when Pietro urged him to leave Milan, to flee to Paris, to save himself. "No," Cesare said. "If I vanish, they win." So he stayed. The boy who once wrote in the margins of dusty textbooks now had the ears of emperors. But power does not protect. It tempts. It isolates. Cesare realized something terrifying. Revolutions do not come with instructions, and truth, once spoken, belongs to everyone and no one. He began drafting essays to clarify his work, to explain what he meant, but the world no longer wanted explanations. It wanted heroes and villains. Cesare, reluctantly, had become both. And yet, in his quietest moments, he wondered, had he changed the world, or had he simply shouted into the wind? One night, he walked past the execution square. It was empty. No scaffold, no rope, just stone and silence. He stood there a long time. Eventually, he wrote a single line in his notebook. "The greatest triumph of justice is the day it becomes unnecessary." He closed the book, and for the first time in months, he slept. Power is quieter than you'd think. It doesn't arrive with trumpets. It arrives in letters sealed with wax, in summons written in Latin, in a single knock on the door from a man in silk. Cesare Beccaria, reluctant reformer, now found himself among bureaucrats and barons. The Austrian authorities, wary yet intrigued, summoned him to Vienna. His book had stirred not just readers, but rulers, and rulers, Cesare knew, feared one thing above all, ideas that cannot be controlled. He went, not out of ambition, but out of obligation. Milan had grown tight around him like a noose of polite disapproval. Vienna offered distance and strange safety. The city greeted him with cold marble and calculated civility. Enlightenment had its own wardrobe here, powdered wigs, polished manners, and polite cruelty. He met with Joseph II, the Habsburg heir and proto-reformer, a man of intellect, appetite, and impossible contradictions. "You wish to abolish torture?" Joseph mused, swirling his wine. "How curious. I find pain very instructive, especially when others feel it." Cesare smiled thinly. "Then perhaps you've never felt enough of it yourself." The air chilled, and yet, the Emperor laughed. "You're different. Good. We need different." Cesare was offered a position, not just any role. He was invited into the Supreme Economic Council, a body advising on legal reforms across the empire. It was, on paper, a dream. But dreams are made of mist. The council chambers were lined with books Cesare revered and men he loathed. Decisions came slowly, meetings dragged endlessly. Philosophy wilted under bureaucracy. He argued, pleaded, annotated policies in red ink. But each edit was softened, dulled, delayed. He began to feel like a ghost haunting marble. One day, a clerk whispered to him, "They let you speak because it amuses them, not because they intend to listen." Cesare didn't reply. He didn't need to. The disconnect tore at him. In Milan, he had felt hunted. Here, he felt invisible. He missed his friends, missed Pietro's sarcasm, missed Alessandro's fiery letters, missed the smell of ink on Milanese mornings. He began writing them long, wandering letters, more poetry than prose, fragments of memory, pleas in disguise. In those letters, a new voice began to emerge. Not the firebrand of on crimes and punishments, but a quieter Cesare, reflective, disillusioned, and wiser. One night, walking past a courthouse, he saw a boy, no older than 12, dragged in chains by guards. No trial, no advocate, just paperwork and silence. He followed, demanded answers. The boy had stolen bread. Cesare asked to speak on his behalf. The judge refused. Cesare asked again, firmer, a little louder. The judge relented, grudgingly. Cesare argued that punishment should be scaled to circumstance, that starvation was not a crime, that law without compassion is not justice, only procedure. The boy was released. It was a small victory, tiny, almost invisible, but to Cesare, it mattered. He returned to his quarters and wrote that night until his hand cramped. Not a treatise, a parable, a story of a boy and a loaf of bread, and a law that learned to listen. He never published it, but he read it aloud to himself before sleep. That was the night he understood. Reform wasn't a revolution, it was erosion, gentle, relentless. He began drafting a new set of proposals, practical, implementable, dry as dust. But hidden within were tiny bombs of mercy. He pushed them through slowly, quietly. One reduced the number of capital crimes. Another required written records of torture, thus dissuading its use. None bore his name. That was the point. Let them think the system changed itself. He stayed in Vienna for years, long enough to be honoured, long enough to be ignored. Eventually, he left. Not in disgrace, not in triumph, just quietly. He returned to Milan older, leaner, and far less hopeful, but also more dangerous, because now he understood the game, and he knew how to play it from the shadows, in a city of masks and marble. Cesare Beccaria learned the greatest skill of all, how to bend a system without breaking it, and how to speak so softly. Even tyrants leaned in to listen. When Cesare Beccaria returned to Milan, the city had changed, or perhaps it was he who had. The streets were still narrow, the churches still stern, but the silence felt different. He no longer walked in as the boy who wrote a firestorm. He walked in as a man who had once been listened to and then forgotten. He could have vanished then, retired into comfort, raised a family, collected accolades, and quietly let the world move on. But he didn't. Instead, he turned to teaching. At the Palatine School, he stood before boys barely old enough to shave and taught them about justice. Not the kind etched in marble, but the kind that breathed, through restraint, through reason, through rules that served the people, not punished them. He didn't shout, didn't grandstand. He simply explained, patiently, over and over. Some laughed behind his back, called him soft, idealistic, outdated. He smiled. Because a man who has stood in the court of an emperor doesn't need to prove himself to boys with powdered hair and empty opinions. One day, he was asked to write again. The government wanted his thoughts on economic reform, currency, taxation, price control. It was dull work, numbers, margins, trade routes. But Cesare agreed, not because he loved economics, but because he understood power. Change required proximity. Influence needed a perch. He wrote pages that would lull most readers to sleep. But beneath the dryness, he wove principles: fairness, equity, human dignity. He argued for tax policies that didn't crush the poor, for systems that rewarded honest labour, not inherited title. The ministers nodded, approved, implemented. They never realised they were enacting the philosophy of a man who once declared war on death itself, at night. Cesare sat alone in his study, candles flickering low. His desk, once a battlefield of ideas, was now a place of quiet construction. No applause, no fame, just policy drafts and red ink. He missed the thrill sometimes, the roar of change, but he had learned. Revolutions burn, reforms endure, and there was joy in endurance. One evening, a former student visited him, now a magistrate. The young man beamed with pride as he recounted a recent decision, how he had reduced a sentence, citing mitigating factors, and released a mother who stole to feed her child. "I remembered what you said, sir." The student smiled. "Justice isn't about vengeance. It's about proportion." Cesare didn't reply immediately. Then, softly, he said, "That's the loudest thing you'll ever say in a courtroom." That night, he wept, not out of sorrow but recognition. He no longer needed to write treatises. He was writing lives. This chapter of Cesare Beccaria's life passed without monuments. No riots, no reforms with fanfare, just policy, teaching, quiet corrections, a whisper against the wind. But if you listened closely, the wind was changing direction. Milan, 1771. The courtroom air was always too still for a city so loud. It smelled of wet parchment, powdered wigs, and old secrets, just like justice often does. Cesare Beccaria, now in his early 30s, sat in the gallery that day, not as a judge, not as a lawyer, but as a quiet observer, and yet his very presence shifted the weight in the room. That morning, a man stood trial for stealing a loaf of bread. It should have been simple, but in Milan, simplicity was a luxury. The law was not blind, it stared hard, and it remembered. The defendant, barely 20, was gaunt, trembling, lips blue from the cold. He had stolen because his family hadn't eaten in 3 days. Beccaria watched as the prosecutor read the sentence. 3 years of forced labour. The boy's face didn't break. He bowed, like a candle accepting the wind. The crowd nodded. Justice served, or so they thought, but inside Beccaria, something buckled. Again. This wasn't justice. This was precision cruelty. A boy sentenced not for his crime, but for his poverty. And the law, with all its decorum and ceremony, had become a theatre of punishment rather than a compass of fairness. That night he wrote, "The certainty of a small, fair punishment has more power than the threat of a brutal one rarely enforced." It wasn't new, but this time it felt more urgent. Milan was changing. The Enlightenment had arrived like a polite intruder, knocking at doors no one had opened in centuries. But inside courtrooms, feudal shadows still lingered. Punishment was still spectacle. Torture still considered clarifying. Justice still performed for the powerful. Beccaria began meeting with students, younger thinkers, not at salons or lectures, but in the back rooms of bookshops and coffee houses, whispering ideas not just about punishment, but about proportionality, rehabilitation, the insanity of irreversible sentences, even, radically, the role of intention. One student asked, "But what if someone deserves to suffer?" Beccaria, sipping lukewarm coffee, simply replied, "What if the law deserves better than vengeance?" In that moment, he saw their faces shift, not in agreement, but in understanding. A seed had been planted. Still, the institutions around him bristled. Judges whispered about him. Clergy turned their sermons against him. "Beccaria wants to unchain criminals," they'd say. "He cares more for the guilty than the godly." But the truth was simpler. He wanted to stop systems from becoming monsters. A lived historical fact. By 1771, Beccaria had been appointed to the Supreme Economic Council of Milan, where he quietly influenced criminal justice reforms, many of which were adopted, including the reduction of torture use and more humane procedures for trial. His influence had become structural, but Beccaria found no joy in titles. They were distractions, not destinations. His joy was in subversion through ideas. There's a lesser-known moment, barely mentioned in records. One night, he received a letter from a mother. Her son had been sentenced to death for highway theft. She begged for his intercession. Beccaria walked to the courthouse himself the next morning, letter in hand. He didn't argue. He placed the letter on the judge's bench and walked away. The sentence was quietly commuted. Historians still debate whether this was real or one of the many legends that trailed him. But for Beccaria, legend didn't matter. Only the gesture did. What he wrestled with most in those years wasn't the state. It was the creeping idea that perhaps no reform could truly sanitize a system born in blood. Was punishment always necessary? Could society thrive on mercy rather than fear? He didn't have the answers. But he knew the questions were everything. His lesson that year, that justice without compassion is just math. That the law, when divorced from empathy, becomes machinery with no brake lever. And so, in between meetings, In between quiet reforms passed behind closed doors, he'd scribble little notes on margins, napkins, letters. The law should teach, not terrify. Punishment, when too severe, becomes its own crime. Let the law be feared only by the unjust. His daughter once found a page tucked into a book of sermons. It read, "I do not fear evil, I fear indifference in robes." And still, he went on, still, he tried. In the fading candlelight of his study, surrounded by legal manuscripts and questions without answers, Beccaria began to understand something quietly terrifying, that true reform was not loud, it was patient, it was slow, it was invisible until it wasn't, and those who carry it often die long before it blooms, but they plant it anyway. By the late 1770s, Cesare Beccaria had become something dangerous, not a rebel, not a revolutionary, but a respected man with ideas. And that, in Enlightenment Europe, could be even more subversive. Kings could crush uprisings, but a thought could survive centuries. Beccaria now lectured on public economy, not criminal law, not anymore. The University of Milan had given him a professorship, and with it, a strange form of exile. He stood before students, chalk in hand, and spoke of tariffs, trade, labour, supply, topics that wore powdered wigs and spoke in footnotes. But every once in a while, he drifted. He'd draw a curve on the board, pause, and say, "The curve of justice is not always steep. Sometimes it must flatten to accommodate the weak." And then he'd carry on, as if it were just a lesson in numbers. His students would glance at one another, wondering if they'd heard something deeper. They had, because Beccaria had stopped writing publicly. It had been over a decade since De Delitia delle Pene. No new books, no fiery essays, just silence. A silence that drove Voltaire mad. "Write again," he begged. "The world listens." But Beccaria didn't. Couldn't. There's a theory. He had been silenced by the Austrian censors. After all, Milan was under Habsburg rule. Another theory, family pressure. His father wanted no more scandal. But those were guesses. The truth may be simpler and sadder. Beccaria felt alone. He had tried to make the law more humane. He had published, spoken, taught. But the world's appetite for cruelty had not vanished. Executions continued. Torture lingered like mould. Judges quoted him, then ignored his principles. He began walking the city at night, alone, wrapped in a dark coat, hat low. Watching the streets he had once tried to clean with words, he passed prisons. Sometimes. He paused outside their walls, he didn't speak. He just listened. One lived historical fact. Beccaria remained involved in the Milanese justice system, but refused further publication. His retreat from the public eye puzzled Enlightenment thinkers across Europe. There's a curious moment noted in a surviving letter. A student asked him, "Why don't you write again?" Beccaria looked at the young man, eyes tired, and whispered, "Because I now fear what I might say." The pivot was complete. The man who once defied death with prose now feared the weight of his own influence. But silence isn't surrender, it's transformation. Beccaria began focusing on teaching individuals rather than reshaping institutions. If the law would not change, perhaps hearts could, one at a time. He mentored students who would later become judges, advocates, reformers. His ideas moved not in pamphlets, but in people, and perhaps this was his most lasting work. One such student, Giacomo Brunetti, would later abolish public executions in a provincial court. He credited a quiet moment in class when Beccaria, off topic, said, "Justice need not be loud, it only needs to be just." Beccaria's symbolic moment came not in a courtroom, not in a book, but in a small classroom with leaky windows, where he taught future leaders how to think, not just rule. His lesson in this chapter of life, that change, when it fails to shout, can still whisper its way through time, that silence is not always absence. Sometimes it's the soil, and in that silence, Beccaria planted his final seeds. The 1780s crept in quietly. No revolutions, no fires, just the steady tick of history. Cesare Beccaria was no longer a young man. His coat had frayed, his hands had slowed, But in the corners of European courtrooms, his words still echoed. Not loudly, never loudly, but distinctly. In a courtroom in Tuscany, a judge struck down a case involving torture, citing Beccaria. In Stockholm, a Swedish official proposed the abolition of the death penalty. "Have you read the Milanese?" he asked, and in the French salons revolution simmered. Some whispered about Rousseau, others Voltaire, but in dimmer rooms, with wine that tasted like old brass, they talked of Beccaria, the man who wrote as if death itself could be reasoned with. He, meanwhile, stayed in Milan, a public servant now. He worked on currency regulation, roads, and civil code. Nothing glamorous. But then again, was it ever about glamour? Here's your historical fact. In 1786, the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, under Pietro Leopoldo, became the first modern state to abolish the death penalty. They did so while directly citing Beccaria's work. He didn't travel to witness it, didn't send a speech. He just nodded quietly when he heard, a nod so slight you might have missed it. There was a strange melancholy in that. He had dreamed of reform, dreamed so fiercely it burned into the page. But when the dream came true, it arrived with the quiet dignity of a letter slipped under the door. Internally, Beccaria struggled. If the world had truly started to listen, why didn't he feel triumphant? Was it because so many still died needlessly, or because he had no strength left to celebrate? The emotional pivot came late one evening when a colleague asked, half joking, "Cesare, do you feel like a prophet yet?" Beccaria smiled. Prophets don't live to see their temples built. A striking moment followed. That winter he received a letter from an anonymous judge in Poland. "I teach your words to my son, so he may someday pass fair judgment on mine." Beccaria held the letter close to the fireplace, not to burn it, but to feel its warmth. Because the truth was, he no longer needed fame. The lesson was clear now. Ideas do not need to march. They can drift, quietly, like pollen, like thought. He looked back not with pride, nor regret, but with a weary awe at how a single book, born in a surge of defiance, had seeded itself in places he would never see. And still, he stayed in Milan, walking its streets, watching the city pretend nothing had changed, while knowing the very scaffolds had started to rot. Because once a question is asked, should a state be allowed to kill, you cannot unask it, and that was his gift. Not answers, but doubt, the kind that creeps in long after the speech has ended. The final decade came not like a storm, but like fog, slow, enveloping, easy to miss until it was everywhere. Cesare Beccaria, once the firebrand whispering defiance into Enlightenment salons, was now a man of long walks, quiet dinners, and deep stares into cold hearths. His voice, once quick with reform, now spoke only when necessary, not out of bitterness, but because words had done their work. Still, the world tugged at him. Revolutions had begun to spread. France cracked open like an egg on cobblestones. Heads rolled, ironically, in the name of justice. The guillotine was hailed as clean, quick, and rational. Some even called it enlightened. He could have laughed if it hadn't made him sick. That is your historical fact. While the French Revolution was inspired in part by Enlightenment ideals, including Beccaria's, its reign of terror saw tens of thousands executed in the very spirit he tried to dismantle. It was a cruel echo. The philosopher who tried to end state-sanctioned killing lived to see his words twisted into justification for it. That winter, Cesare stopped writing altogether. One night, his daughter asked him, "Papa, do you still believe in what you wrote?" And he said nothing. Not because he didn't, but because belief, like grief, sometimes becomes too large for words. The emotional pivot. He began rereading his own book, not as its author, but as a stranger might. He found sentences he no longer remembered writing. Some made him proud, some made him wince, all made him quiet. The striking moment came in a letter, again unsigned, slipped into his window. It read, "I am a soldier. I once killed a man legally. I now read your book nightly." Cesare held it in trembling hands. Not because it was praise, but because it was confession. What lesson could be pulled from that? That change doesn't always look like celebration. Sometimes it looks like guilt, like reflection, like pause. Sometimes it looks like someone sleeping a little less soundly, because they've begun to question what they once called duty. In those final months, Beccaria refused all public engagements. He would not endorse revolutions, nor condemn them. He walked his city in a worn coat, stopped occasionally to watch students argue in cafes, smiled faintly when he heard his name. But mostly, he faded, not in legacy, in presence. He had said what he came to say, and now he waited for history to catch up, or not. And in the quiet, he hoped that even if they forgot his name, the world might one day remember the shape of mercy. Cesare Beccaria died quietly, in 1794, in the same city that had once spat at his ideas and later read them by candlelight. No mobs gathered, no monuments were built that week. Just a man, returned to dust, while Europe boiled in the fire of revolutions and retributions. And yet, the silence left in his wake was louder than any applause. This is your final lived historical fact. Beccaria died before seeing the abolition of torture across most of Europe. But his book, on crimes and punishments, was translated into multiple languages and influenced legal systems from Tuscany to Pennsylvania. In America, founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams quoted him. In Russia, Catherine the Great read his words before rewriting her empire's code. In Tuscany, a Grand Duke outlawed the death penalty, the first modern state to do so, citing Beccaria directly. The emotional pivot came not from fame, but from how quickly it grew impersonal. His name was now shorthand in courtrooms, detached from the man who once trembled before a trial. But the most symbolic moment, it came long after his death, when a prison reformer in 1820 quoted Beccaria in a speech, and no one in the crowd recognized the name. They simply nodded, as though these ideas had always been true. The lesson: if you argue with death long enough, sometimes death changes the terms. Cesare never wore robes of power. He never swung a sword. His battlefield was logic, and his weapon was shame. And though he lost most debates in his lifetime, he won something stranger: time. He changed how we speak about justice, not with volume, but with persistence. Today, when a judge weighs guilt with caution, when a jury asks for mercy, when a state pauses before killing in the name of order, Cesare is there, not in name, in shadow, in breath, in pause. A man who never stopped believing that the state should not become what it condemns, that punishment should never outgrow the crime, that justice, at its best, looks more like restraint than revenge, and that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is ask the world to stop. Close your eyes. Forget the name. Forget the powdered wigs, the quills, the marble courts echoing with verdicts. Just imagine a single man, walking home in the fog, his coat thin, his heart full of questions. He's not a warrior, not a king. He never led an army or staged a rebellion, but he dared to ask something no one else would. What if justice meant mercy? What if the state, for all its laws and punishments, was not meant to frighten, but to protect? Cesare Beccaria argued with death, not to deny its inevitability, but to demand it show its math. And in doing so, he gave us something that now hides quietly in the margins of our lives. Each time a sentence is debated, each time a punishment is measured twice, each time we hesitate before turning cruelty into policy, that's him, still whispering, still weighing, still walking. History forgets faces, but it remembers shapes, like the curve of a question mark, the pause before judgment, the hush that asks, "Are we sure?" That hush is where he lives now. So tonight, as the world spins and headlines scream and the internet never sleeps, pause. Let Beccaria remind you that change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives gently, like a soft voice in a cold room, asking if we could try to be better, not louder, just better, and maybe that's enough.